Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining the third talk on our lecture series in network inequalities. Today, we have the pleasure to virtually host Luc Guerdan, a PhD student in the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon. In his research, Luc leverages methods from HCI, machine learning, and causal inference to support better informed evaluations of algorithmic systems. And today, he will tell us more about human algorithm decision-making under imperfect proxy labels. Luc, the floor is all yours.
Great. Thank you, Lisette, for the invitation to speak and for to Complexity Science Hub Vienna for the invitation. It's really exciting to be able to chat with everyone today. And yeah, good morning to everyone in North America, and good afternoon to folks who are joining from Europe as well. So for today, I'll be telling you about work that's joint with Amanda Costin and my advisors, Stephen Wu and Ken Holstein. And this work is a combination of two papers that were presented this past year at FACT. And I'll be talking about each of the papers, where relevant, but really it's part of a broader kind of framework that we're developing for human algorithm decision-making, particularly in cases where the labels that are being used for prediction and evaluation imperfectly reflect the goals of decision makers. And this is a really important area because oftentimes predictive models target labels that imperfectly reflect the goals of human decision makers. So for instance, the toxicity labels that are targeted by content moderation tools often reflect the subjective and context-dependent opinion of the person who annotated an example as toxic or non-toxic, rather than a ground truth notion of toxic or not toxic. Similarly, here in Allegheny County, actually in Pittsburgh, models that are used to support social workers in child maltreatment screening often predict the risk that a child will be removed from their home within 2 years. And social workers themselves have reported that this actually differs from their own goals of assessing immediate threats to child safety. And finally, one widely deployed clinical decision support tool used to identify high-risk patients predicted the dollar cost of their hospital visit. But the cost of medical care really is an imperfect proxy for medical need, because many patients might have received artificially low costs in the past due to lack of insurance or other discriminatory factors. And this is really a key challenge because models that are targeting imperfect labels can often introduce really harmful and damaging downstream impacts. For example, the clinical decision support algorithm that I just told you about, which was actually deployed throughout the United States, resulted in 28% fewer Black patients receiving the additional care that they needed as compared to similarly sick white ones. In this example, as well as the many others that we cite in our work, underscore that a predictive model targeting the wrong outcome is unlikely to help a human make the right decision. And to make this challenge even worse, often models that are targeting these imperfect labels can fail when they're deployed in the real world in silent and hard to detect ways. So this is an image of the bridge collapse here in Pittsburgh, actually, the Fernahalla Bridge a year ago. And when a bridge fails or other infrastructure fails, it's quite obvious. You can really tell that there is a problem. But oftentimes, predictive models are failing in silent ways that are very hard to detect. And as we'll see today, this is the case with a lot of decision support tools that are being developed that target imperfect labels. However, when we look at existing research, we see that it often assumes that models target so-called ground truth labels. So for instance, one growing body of research conducts experimental human subject studies, which examine how behavioral interventions such as explanations influence human trust and reliance patterns and the mental models of humans as they use ML-based systems. And then on the other machine learning side, we also see that there's a lot of literature that's developing modeling techniques, such as deferral-based learning, that are really designed from the ground up to account for the limitations of human-based judgment. But both of these lines of literature tend to operationalize good decision-making as an improvement to accuracy on proxy labels, on the labels that we have readily available in our development data sets. And additionally, we also often assume when measuring fairness-related harms that we have more equity when we have less disparity on these observed proxy labels. And as a result, our current measurements of overall system performance and of fairness-related harms, it can be really skewed and biased by the imperfect labels that we have available in our data set. And connecting this back to the theme of today's talk, so we're talking, this is for Complexity Science Hub Vienna, we're thinking about complex systems and also network inequality. We also know that studies of online social networks often also assume that models target so-called ground truth labels. So we have, for instance, toxicity, hate speech, or misinformation are 3 common kind of phenomena of interest when we're trying to study, patterns of dissemination of information on online social networks. But these constructs too are often operationalized imperfectly via different annotation protocols, which can really skew the results of these annotations quite a bit. So really, these are measurements of these broader phenomenon that we're interested in, rather than a ground truth measurement of toxicity, hate speech, or misinformation itself. So therefore, in today's talk, I'll be providing a causal framework for proxy labels in human algorithm decision making. This is basically a way to think about and to begin to address some of these label-related issues. And this framework helps researchers and practitioners disentangle conceptually different sources of statistical bias that are impacting proxy labels. So we're giving some tools to think about these issues a bit more. This also helps to re-examine the design of prior experimental human AI decision-making studies. And finally, this framework also helps to support the design of more reliable predictive modeling tools going forward. So I'll talk today mostly about the first and the second point for this framework. And I'll leave some of the discussion of the prior studies, re-examining the design of prior studies to the end of the talk. So I have some additional slides for that we can talk about during Q&A if audience members are interested. And before I begin introducing this framework, I'd also like to orient and discuss how the ideas that I'll be discussing kind of connect into a broader network setting. So the framework that we've developed is designed for kind of the basic non-sequential predictive modeling context. And as a result, we didn't develop our approach from the ground up thinking about network data in mind. But you can generally think about this framework as characterizing the effects of proxy labels on each node within a larger network, kind of thinking about node-specific challenges. But we're not thinking about the kind of ways in which interactions on one node could influence, the interactions of others, which we know is a very rich and important areas to discuss as well. So in the end of this talk, I'll connect these ideas back to the network setting, and I'll think about some of the additional challenges that we might want to discuss. But you can kind of think about this as a necessary set of issues, but not sufficient set of issues that could impact proxy labels in larger network settings. So I'll connect this back with some specific examples to the network setting towards the end of this talk. Before introducing the framework, I'd like to give you a bit of context or background about how we developed it. So we first reviewed a diverse set of online real-world case studies, and we synthesized these into different candidate causal diagrams that were explaining the relationship between different variables across human AI decision-making tasks. And then we stress tested these by attempting to identify counterexamples. And throughout this iterative process, we referenced a broad set of relevant literature from machine learning and HCI, while also seeking input from researchers from other relevant areas that think about measurement quite often. With this in mind, I'll go ahead and introduce our causal framework now. So this is a causal diagram for thinking about the human algorithm decision-making process, and then also for different biases that impact proxy labels. So I'll introduce this framework in an example in which we're introducing a model to predict heart attack outcomes. So in this setting, let's suppose that we have a physician that's making a decision that's being informed by an algorithm, such as which medicine to prescribe, as well as a model prediction. And together, these two factors make for a joint human model decision. Now, the goal here is to predict a target outcome, which in this case is biological heart attack. But instead, we have access to a proxy variable, which contains heart attack diagnosis and medical records. Now, heart attack diagnosis is often an imperfect proxy for actual biological heart attack, because as many as 45% of heart attacks are so-called silent and go undiagnosed. However, we can think about characterizing the relationship between the target and proxy outcomes via a measurement model. And I'll give some examples of these later on in today's talk. We also have access to some predictors because we're developing a model. So these can be different sources of administrative, EHR data that can be used as model features, such as blood pressure or body mass index. And we also have access to some unobserved contextual factors. So these are things such as real-time results of medical tests that a doctor might see when they're making decisions that an algorithm wouldn't have access to. And we can begin to describe the relationship between these different nodes via edges. So for instance, model features can influence both the model prediction and the human decision that are being made, but the human-only features are only going to influence the human decision. Additionally, we can kind of extend this analysis to think about how different factors are going to influence each other across algorithmic decision support tasks. And we can fill in the different edges in this diagram through a similar approach. And here, when we show these edges that are not connected, or not directed, I should say, these are relationships that can vary across the specific decision support setting. but these directed edges indicate settings where we believe that this relationship would hold across all algorithmic decision support tasks. And while I've introduced this with a specific, heart attack prediction example, this framework generalizes to many other prediction tasks that are commonly studied in the literature. Great, so now that I've introduced this framework to you, let's talk about how we can use it to disentangle different sources of statistical bias that impact proxy labels in predictive modeling tasks. So one really commonly discussed challenge impacting proxy labels is called outcome measurement error. And this occurs when the target construct being predicted, such as creditworthiness, student learning, or online or toxicity of a comment, is imperfectly operationalized by the observed labels, such as repayment within 2 years, or student test outcome, or diagnosis of a disease. So when there's a systematic difference between the target outcome that we're trying to predict and the proxy that we actually have available in our data set, this can give rise to outcome measurement error. However, our graph also discusses other sources of statistical bias that can impact proxy labels as well. So for instance here, treatment effects and selective labels occur when the decision that's being informed by an algorithm impacts the downstream outcomes that we're trying to predict. So for instance, if we're developing a content moderation program and we're trying to screen comments proactively that may or may not arise on come up on a social media feed. Well, if we were deciding to remove these comments, then that's going to influence any kind of user reports of toxicity that might be then used later on as labels. Or similarly in the child welfare domain, opening an investigation on allegations of alleged abuse can also change the likelihood of proxies that we're trying to predict downstream, such as out-of-home placement and foster care. And there's kind of some tricky issues here related to treatment effects and selective labels. Additionally, as we discuss in our paper, unobserved confounding can occur when there's some unobservables that humans have access to while making their decisions that impact the prior decisions that they made in the downstream outcome. And selection bias can also occur here if model features are influencing historical decisions that were made. So if we were making decisions in the past that were non-random, this will skew the distribution of the data set that we have, which can make it more challenging to generalize to the full population at deployment time. Our framework also allows researchers to map decision support tasks to relevant sources of statistical bias. So for instance, when decisions impact downstream outcomes, the full set of modeling challenges that I've just told you about is a concern. And this is really a setting that's very common in a lot of real-world model deployment contexts, such as in lending and criminal justice domains. And this is because the decision of whether to approve a loan or release a defendant is going to then impact whether or not this outcome is observed. So many real-world tasks when we're actually trying to inform an intervention with an algorithm are really going to be subject to this full set of issues that I've talked about. However, there's also a simplified setting in which the decision does not impact the outcome, which we call the decision independent setting, in which only outcome measurement error is of concern. So for instance, if we're trying to predict the nutrient content in food, or also just assign a toxicity label to a piece of content, well, this can be subject to outcome measurement error, but because we're not selectively observing examples based on prior decisions, there's a smaller set of issues that are at play. And you can think intuitively about this example with nutrient content prediction as, our prediction of the nutrient content in food isn't going to impact the actual ground truth, nutritional properties of that dish. Great, so now that I've told you about our overall framework, and I've also given a sense of how you can use it to conceptually think about different issues of statistical bias impacting proxy labels, especially across different decision-making tasks, I'd like to tell you now about how we can actually use these tools more concretely to design more reliable predictive models. So we know that in the real world, when we're actually developing and deploying models, it's possible that these reliability challenges and these sources of bias impacting labels can interact in really important ways. So as a kind of an example to think about this, let's suppose that we enroll a patient in a high-risk care management program, which involves closer monitoring and prescribing some additional medication. Now, this additional closer monitoring has been shown to decrease the overall risk of cardiovascular disease. So it can make it less likely that a patient's really going to have a bad cardiovascular outcome or event. But at the same time, this closer patient monitoring can also increase the likelihood of various conditions being correctly identified and diagnosed. So we're giving additional medical supervision, which can actually make it more likely that we're going to find relevant issues. So in this case, we have some treatment effects of the decision on the target outcome that we're trying to predict. then we also have this impact of the target outcome, this difference between the target outcome and the measured outcome that we're going to predict that really varies depending on the decision. And we can think about this through the causal diagram that I just introduced a second ago, where we have these edges from the decisions to the outcomes as well as the outcomes themselves. So we kind of have this relationship between these different factors. And this is kind of what treatment conditional outcome measurement error would look like in our causal diagram. So I'll talk about a framework that we developed to address this setting, but also this is a situation that's likely to arise in a lot of settings with network data as well. So after I introduce our framework and talk about it, I'll talk about how this problem can also arise in network data settings and also the extent to which our approach is able to tackle those as well. Great, so let's set up this problem in more detail. So in our setting, we're given some features such as electronic medical records, prior decisions that were made in the past by doctors, so which medicine to prescribe, for example. And then we observe a corresponding proxy outcome, such as whether a patient was diagnosed with a heart attack and medical records, given the past treatment decisions that doctors were making. Now, these three factors are observed in our data sets. This is the kind of common observational data setup. But what we're really interested in predicting here is the target outcome of whether a patient would experience biological heart attack if they were given the different treatment options that we're trying to consider by our algorithm. So what we really are curious in is biologically whether heart attack would occur under treatment T. And this is what's called a potential outcome in causal inference setups. And more formally, our goal here is basically to predict the unobserved target outcome of interest given these observed data sources that we have here, which is basically regressing on y star given x. However, because this is a causal quantity, we have to make certain assumptions, such as no unmeasured confounding, which is basically saying that there's no unobservables that I discussed earlier. So there's no factors that the human is aware of that's impacting both prior decisions and the outcome. Also, we have to assume positivity, which basically means that every example has some chance of receiving each decision in the past. So every patient had some chance of getting both of the medical treatments, as well as consistency. And the consistency assumption is actually a bit more complex, so there's some more nuance around it. And this really actually impacts the validity of this modeling formulation for network setups. So I'll talk about that during the discussion phase and also the extension phase of this framework here in a minute or two. So in addition to these causal assumptions, we also want to think about the measurement error relationship. And so we basically need to make some assumptions about the relationship between the target and the proxy outcome if our goal is to be able to actually correct from this measurement error and learn reliable models. So there's kind of two cases here. And the first is that the target outcome does occur. So let's assume that biological heart attack does occur, but it goes undiagnosed. Well, this will occur at the false negative rate. So that the false negative rate proportion of examples are mislabeled, where heart attack does occur, but it's not picked up by our observed labels. And of course, we can also have the opposite setup where heart attack does not occur, but it's falsely recorded as happening. So this is given by the false positive rate. And we can model this through this closed form measurement model, where we have this transformation of the false negative rate and the false positive rate by these parameters alpha and beta. And these can vary across the treatments that we're trying to inform by an algorithm. But basically what this is assuming is that the target probability, eta star, so the probability of the true outcome that we're trying to predict under action T, is going to be transformed by these measurement error parameters to then yield the proxy probability. So this is an extension of a setup that's studied quite a bit in machine learning literature, which is called like the class conditional error setting. This is a fairly standard model, but it also assumes that the measurement error properties do not depend on the covariates X. This is an assumption that's actually quite strong. And we can talk about ways to extend this to that setting as well, but it kind of adds some additional nuances to how you actually try to extract or measure the measurement relationship as well. But in any event, this is one way that you can write down a measurement model connecting the unobserved target outcome to the observed proxy. However, one really key challenge that you might think about when we talk about this overall setup is first, how can we actually understand this relationship between the target and the proxy outcome? So I just told you that this model assumes that there's a relationship of the false positive and false negative rate that are relating the target and the proxy outcomes. But of course, we often don't know what these are in practice because we never truly get to observe the biological heart attack outcome with true fidelity, unless we have some additional medical resources. So for example, we're able to do a very invasive, careful test for all patients at all times. But often we don't exactly know the relationship between the target and the proxy outcome. So we propose an approach for getting around this via using expert knowledge in the form of what we call anchoring assumptions. And so let me tell you about a couple ways that we can actually encode expert knowledge through these anchor assumptions. So I'll introduce a couple of these assumptions now. The min anchor assumption holds that there's a patient in the population that is at no risk of heart attack. So this just assumes that there's some patient, we don't necessarily know who, but this patient doesn't have any risk of this heart attack outcome occurring, the true biological heart attack outcome. And this can be reasonable if there's some subset of patients that we can really give a very careful test, and we maybe know something about the data generating mechanism for them. So we know it's very unlikely that they're actually going to experience heart attack, and we're willing to assume that there's no chance, at a given time of them experiencing it. And conversely, the max anchor assumption basically says the same thing, but it just assumes that heart attack is certain to occur for some patient, again, based on some detailed knowledge of their physiology. For both of these, we don't need to know exactly who this holds for. We just need to be confident that it holds for at least one person. And finally, the base rate anchor assumes that we know the average risk of heart attack, the true heart attack outcome across the full population. This is basically the prevalence of this outcome. A really important benefit of this sort of modeling approach is that we can actually flexibly combine these anchoring assumptions to estimate the measurement error relationship between the target and the proxy outcome. So here you can see many different settings. So if we know the base rate and we know the false positive rate, then basically we can use this to identify the relationship between the target and the proxy outcome. And there are many different pairwise combinations of these two pieces of information that we can actually use to learn a model that corrects for the measurement error. So basically this informal theorem here, which you can look at in our paper for the full details, basically states that under our causal assumptions, the false positive and the false negative rates are identifiable from observational data. So now that we've introduced a way of actually understanding the relationship between the target and the proxy outcome, let's talk about how we can use this knowledge to actually learn a model that corrects for outcome measurement error. And what we really like when we're learning a model in the setup that I've just given you is we'd like to have a data set where we have our covariates X and then the corresponding target outcome. So this is the corresponding outcome for if true biological heart attack would occur if we prescribe treatment T. And if we had a data set that looked like this would be a pretty straightforward task because we could really take any kind of standard supervised learning approach and we could just predict that target outcome and regress it on our observed features. So we could kind of learn any model such as logistic regression or some boosting style approach, whatever we think is best suited for our domain, and just directly approach or predict this outcome of interest. And under the hood, the way that this works is through the process of risk minimization. So we basically have some ideal risk, which is basically minimizing this loss over all of our different examples. And this is doing it against these true target outcomes of interest y star sub t. So basically, if we minimize this risk, the empirical version of it rather, then we can recover a predictor that does a good job of targeting this outcome of interest. However, in our setting, the issue is that the data set that we actually get to see is just the covariates, the corresponding treatment, and then this proxy outcome. We don't actually get to see the target potential outcome of interest. So the way around this is that we basically can learn a corrected model that adjusts for the difference between the observed proxy label and the unobserved target outcome of interest. And the way that we do this is by minimizing a corrected risk. And this corrected risk basically combines a couple different ingredients to address the different modeling challenges or sources of target variable bias that I've just discussed earlier in the talk. So basically, we first add this reweighting function, which makes examples that are observed less frequently more important in the loss objective. And this is addressing selection bias through kind of a standard inverse propensity weighting style approach, or we're just reweighting examples based on their prevalence in the population. We also minimize a modified loss that's parameterized by the measurement relationship that we've determined in the previous step through these anchoring assumptions. So this is basically, we can construct a closed form expression for our loss that depends on the measurement parameters, and we can minimize this loss in place of the kind of standard loss, and this part corrects for the measurement error aspect of our outcomes. And then finally, if we minimize this risk over the population that received treatment T, then we can learn a counterfactual predictor that's actually predicting the outcome, conditional on the treatment. And so basically we can combine these different ingredients here to learn a predictor that recovers a risk for basically a good surrogate for the ideal risk that we're trying to minimize. And in particular, we have this result in our paper, which I can state informally, which basically states that under our assumptions, our causal assumptions, this corrected risk that I've just told you about is equivalent to the ideal risk that we'd like to minimize over target outcomes. And the key takeaway or the punchline here is that we can actually use our observed data, the X's, the prior treatments, and the outcomes to just directly learn a predictor for the target outcome of interest. So we don't have to worry about basically trying to identify this outcome exactly, as long as we're willing to make the measurement assumptions that I've talked about previously. And at this stage, you might be wondering, what is the relative impact of outcome measurement error, treatment effects, and selection bias, and how important is it to correct for these with our approach? And so we address this question through our evaluation by systematically varying which reliability challenges are being addressed by a model. So you can see here, we construct a modeling setup where we correct for outcome measurement error, one where we correct for treatment effects, and then also an additional one in which we correct for selection bias. And we can combine these corrections in various ways to see the relative improvement in our performance and reliability as we add additional corrections for these three different challenges. So to illustrate the relative impact of these, we begin with a synthetic evaluation. So in this plot here, I'm showing you the accuracy of different models as a function of the size of the training data set. So as we add additional training data set examples, we're looking at the performance. And in particular, we're interested in where the performance plateaus at. Where does it reach a peak in which additional data doesn't actually help us in our objective? So here I'll introduce these different approaches that I'm comparing here. So the TPO is basically an oracle that's providing the best possible performance. So this is the performance that we would have if we actually just predicted that target potential outcome directly. So if we just predicted that example that I showed, the y star sub t, just that direct outcome that we're interested in, if we knew that exactly and we could predict it, this is providing an upper benchmark on the performance of our approach based on actually observing the outcome that we're interested in directly. This orange line here is our proposed approach that combines reweighting, this measurement error correction, and the counterfactual objective. And so basically, when you combine all these different corrections, our approach performs quite well. But what you can see here is that this is the solid setting is where we know the measurement error parameters exactly, as well as the reweighting weights. And then this dashed setting is when we don't know these and we're trying to learn these from our data set. So you can see that we get worse performance when we actually need to learn the weights and the measurement error parameters from our data set. The next set of lines here in blue is the setting where we don't apply any reweighting, but we do apply the measurement error correction, and we also correctly minimize this as a conditional outcome function. So we correct for treatment effects and measurement error, but we don't correct for selection bias. And you can see that we have a higher performance improvement from our approach that adds reweighting when we know the weights exactly, but when we don't know the weights here, we can see that the two approaches perform about the same. And additionally, these two approaches are basically just correcting for treatment effects or measurement error or applying no correction at all. And really the key takeaway here is that models that don't correct for measurement error and treatment effects perform quite unreliably across all settings. However, this is really on a synthetic setup, so it's not actually getting at how are models performing when they're deployed in more realistic real-world conditions. So to get at this question more directly, we'll now develop a semi-synthetic evaluation in which we can actually use data from real-world randomized controlled trials. So we use two data sets. The first one is from healthcare, and the second is from the employment domain. And this first data set is the Oregon Health Insurance Experiment, which basically is a study in which Oregon residents were randomly enrolled or provided the opportunity to enroll in Medicaid based on a lottery. And we construct a prediction task in which we're predicting diagnosis with a new active chronic condition 1 year after the lottery. And then in the employment domain here, this is what we use the jobs data set, which is a combination of a randomized controlled trial. And also there's an additional observational cohort that's kind of added to it as well. And here the intervention is a job retraining program. And we're predicting several years later whether the participant in the retraining program will be unemployed. So we have to be very careful about how we're constructing prediction tasks because we want to systematically insert these reliability challenges impacting labels and then be able to actually evaluate it on an unseen test data set in which none of these challenges are of a concern. So the way that we get around this is we insert synthetic measurement error in our training data set by assuming that the labels that are given to us, the job employment outcome and the diagnosis with a new chronic medical condition, we assume that the labels that we see are actually the target outcomes. So those are the perfect outcomes. And then we flip those target outcomes with a false negative rate and a false positive rate that we know exactly. So basically, we assume that the labels we're given are the target outcomes, and then we generate proxies by the synthetic error insertion process. And this is important because then we know that the measurement relationship holds exactly. And we also insert synthetic selection bias by basically changing the population that received the Medicaid enrollment lottery and did not receive the Medicaid enrollment lottery to mimic a setting in which decisions in the past were being made non-randomly. And then in our test data set, we ensure that there's no measurement error that's impacting labels there, and also no selection bias. And this allows us to get an effective assessment of the relative performance of each approach in a setting where none of these reliability challenges are a concern. Okay, so now let's look at a plot looking at the performance of our approaches in this setting. And here what I'm showing you is in this plot, the performance that's close to 0 is better. And in particular, our performance measure here is the average treatment effect error. So it's the difference between the true treatment effect and the predicted treatment effect by our prediction approaches. So an approach that has a bias or error closer to 0 is preferable. And what we're doing is we're actually systematically varying the false negative rate and false positive rate that are impacting the proxy labels. And then we're looking at the performance of our approaches across these different settings. So this first approach that I'm showing you here is basically applying no correction to any of the models. And as you can see here, the overall performance difference really depends on the measurement relationship, but overall it's quite far from 0. The second approach just corrects for measurement error. So if we correct for measurement error alone, we actually see that we get good performance on the OHI data set, but worse performance in the jobs. But this is really an artifact of this OHI task in which the ground truth treatment effect is near 0. And in the job setting where the treatment effect is further away from 0, we see worse performance. And it's a similar story if we just correct for treatment effects, but not measurement error. However, if we add this treatment effect and measurement error correction, the model performs much more reliably. We see across measurement settings that we're getting estimates of the treatment effect that are less biased and are closer to having less error basically overall. And when we add this correction for selection bias, we actually don't observe a large improvement. We see overall that the performance is about the same. And this is showing that we're getting the most relative performance improvement from treatment effects to measurement error correction, but less from selection bias. And we believe that this is the case because there's not a large amount of distribution shift or selection bias impacting these data sets. So it could just be that reweighting is not necessary to actually achieve good task performance. And when we compare this against an approach that just directly targets the outcome of interest, we see that the performance of our approaches is on par with this model that has the best possible performance in which it can actually just see the target outcome of interest directly. However, this evaluation makes an important assumption, and we're assuming that with our correction approaches that we actually know the measurement error relationship exactly. And oftentimes, this is not the case. What we can see here is that actually specifying valid anchor assumptions is really critical if we want to get reliable performance. So here on the left and the right, these are settings where we're using the max anchor. So we're assuming that there's an example in the data set that has risk that's exactly 1. And in the middle one here, we're using the min anchor in combination with this base rate assumption. The base rate, as you recall, is basically knowing the expected value of the outcome. So it's the prevalence of the outcome. So in this case, because the max anchor assumption isn't valid, it's not actually reasonable for our data set. Both of these approaches perform poorly when we're using the max anchor assumption for error parameter estimation. However, if we use the min anchor assumption, which is satisfied in this context, and the base rate, then we actually achieve a much more reliable predictive model performance. And this is really showing that it's important to specify these measurement assumptions correctly and for them to hold to actually recover a model that's valid and that's achieving the correct prediction task. Great, so this is the overall evaluation of our approach, and I've kind of told you about how we can actually learn valid prediction models in this kind of standard simplified setting, which we're just predicting an outcome offline. But given the subject of today's talk, thinking about network inequality and also thinking about complexity, network complexity and emergence more generally, I want to also talk about how we can connect these ideas to settings in which there's networks as well. And as I said before, recall that we're studying a setting in which you can kind of think about the ideas that I've just discussed as occurring at one node within a network. So you can think about, so suppose we want to predict the toxicity of a label, that a user is posting. Well, these different issues or sources of bias can impact the measurement process that are impacting the labels for each user, how we actually measure toxicity, misinformation or hate speech, et cetera. But of course, in network settings, it's much more complicated because we need to think about the interactions between different nodes. That's the entire challenge that arises in network settings. And to begin to think about how some of these ideas might generalize to network settings, one example that we can think about is the birdwatch sort of approaches, because we're often interested in node level interventions to make some change at a network level. So for instance, reducing the spread of toxicity or misinformation. And this is a kind of a very famous example where Twitter is providing some interventions to stop users from sharing content that is likely to be false or disputed. However, when we think about treatment conditional error, we actually think that this how we measure misinformation at the node level can actually be impacted by the treatment that we're taking and that we're actually using to inform an algorithm. So for instance, here, suppose that this misinformation label actually depends on user reports. So let's suppose that whether or not something is actually flagged or labeled as misinformation varies in some way based on users actually reporting that some tweet as being false in some capacity. Now, if we add a misinformation flag as an intervention, this can actually change factual content changes. So maybe the post creator could actually change the content while also increasing user reports. If users are seeing this and it's saying, hey, we think this could be misinformation, this can also make it more likely that the users are to actually flag it as occurring. So this is a setting in which the treatment that we're informing by an algorithm can actually impact the measurement that we're actually getting and trying to reason about. So in this case, misinformation. However, the complexity in network settings, of course, is that the treatment that we provide to one user, so showing this flag to one user, can propagate through the network as well. So if we show one user this misinformation flag, before they repost something, this can make it less likely that another user downstream is going to actually encounter this content later on. Maybe it's less likely they're going to share it, or our measurement as this being potentially including misinformation can also just make it more or less likely that the algorithm is going to promote it in feeds, et cetera. But generally, there's this issue where the treatment that we're assigning to one node can propagate to other nodes. However, this is basically directly violating an assumption of our modeling framework called consistency, which basically is assuming that there's no interference effects or no systematic effect of the intervention on one node and then impacting another. Basically, we have to assume that the treatment that you provide, at one point is fully going to determine that the treatment that you're actually observing in your data set. So this consistency assumption basically assumes independence in the intervention across all the different outcomes. And this is going to, again, fail in network settings. So I think there's a really clear opportunity also to think about extensions of this framework to settings with network data and how we can generally use this to reason about the validity of different interventions and measurements in these more complex settings. But I think there's a lot more work to do to think about how to set up this modeling problem correctly in that setting. So a couple of takeaways that I'll provide here is that, labels that are used for classification and prediction are often subject to measurement error. So if we think about toxicity or misinformation, or also if we think about things like poverty or crime, these things are often imperfectly measured by our social systems. We're not able to observe these things directly. And there's a whole suite of complicated issues that impact these. So second, our framework is offering a starting point for conceptualizing and thinking about some of these issues that can impact our measurements. But really, this framework is designed for a more simplified setting. And when we want to expand it to other more complex settings, such as with networks, I think there's an additional set of issues to think about on top of the ones that I've even discussed today, which I think is an exciting area for future research. And I'm kind of curious in hearing what audience members think about this as well during Q&A about different opportunities for extension as well. And finally, our algorithmic technique can be used to correct for some of these issues, especially in more simplified settings. But more work is really needed, especially in network settings, to ensure that we're able to actually correct for these in practice. And I've talked about algorithmic correction here, but there's also a much broader set of considerations to make about the actual measurement aspect of how we're actually getting data and effectively representing it in our data sets and basically assessing the validity of different prediction tasks that we're considering. Great, so I'd like to wrap up here and provide some time for Q&A and discussion. But I want to thank you for attending today, and I look forward to answering your questions. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks a lot, Luke. Thank you for this insightful talk. I want people here wants to ask something. Questions for people online? If people online have questions, please raise your hand and feel free to unmute. Here we have a question. So my question is, I feel in your example of the health use of the model, you're trying to make what it's diagnostic tool to diagnosis based on the data, and then the input of the doctor. You want to make a diagnosis tool to help the medical doctor. Which you also introduce what is called the sensitivity analysis and specificity, because you're trying to measure the false negative and false positive. Right? So my question is, would it be possible, because there is no diagnostic tool that is 100% sensitive and 100% specific, and would it be possible to have that spectrum in your diagnostic tool so people know, and then also to have to tune it based on the disease, because there are some diseases that's better for you to have a high sensitivity, and there's also the other one that's better to have a high specificity. So, for example, a rare disease is or a disease with a high mortality rate. Yeah, that's my question. I hope you get to it.
Got it. Yes, yeah, that's an excellent question. And yeah, in a lot of real world settings where we don't have like perfect sensitivity or specificity, or also there's just a lot more generally uncertainty or nuance in the overall measurement relationship between the target and the proxy outcome. And I actually view kind of the measurement model that I showed you here as a starting point, or one of the coarsest or most basic models that you might introduce in these settings. So I think that there are some ways under a framework that you could think about settings where you have some preference between sensitivity and specificity, and you want to vary that threshold more. And in particular, there's some variants of the max and min anchor assumptions that I've talked about that you could explore. So assuming that the risk isn't exactly 0 or 1. But I do think that there is a space for more nuanced measurement models, or even thinking about this in terms of like priors, or thinking about the overall trade-off that you have about sensitivity and specificity, and providing more nuance in the measurement process. And then I also kind of alluded to this briefly during the talk, but we're also assuming that this doesn't depend on the covariates or the features at all, this measurement relationship, which we know from a lot of prior empirical data isn't the case. So that's to say, there are some modifications to this that could be directly supported by our framework, but I think there's also an opportunity for more space in thinking about more trade-offs of this, like thinking about the sensitivity specificity trade-off, for example. But yeah, thank you so much for your question.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Thank you so much for the doctors. A lot to digest. So my question is mostly clarification to see if I got the main ideas that interested me the most already. So from what I got from your presentation, to me it's relatively clear that you have proven how you have to be careful and tackle these possible biases, selection bias, measurement bias, etc. Using these examples with synthetic and semi-synthetic data sets. So my question is, in other realistic data sets where it's not actually possible to have this ground truth, I guess, or I wonder if there is any kind of I don't know, guarantee of the accuracy or the improvement in accuracy that you would get if you apply each of these strategies, basically, because it feels like, even if it makes sense, definitely conceptually, and also you prove it with these studies that you did, it still feels like a shot in the dark, right? Like, I don't know, you do this, for example, this hated speech study, then sure, it should improve, but like, what are the guarantees? Like, I don't know, theoretical or empirical guarantees that you could have here?
Yeah, that's an excellent question that I think gets to the core of a lot of these issues that I've talked about today. I think that it is, to your point, like I have this slide at the very beginning, with this bridge, right? And it's that these models often fail when these issues impact models. It impacts your evaluation with respect to the proxies, right? So you're not actually picking up these issues with respect to the real thing that you're trying to predict, which makes it very difficult to really effectively measure and assess these challenges. In terms of guarantees, or thinking about, I think also your question's getting at, like, how can we know, or like have some assurance that we're actually making progress towards the thing we actually care about, or what is the sensitivity to it? I think that, we've actually thought about how to develop formal or theoretical guarantees against these issues. The issue is that each of them kind of inserts additional uncertainty in the evaluation. So for instance, with measurement error, actually, there's some really great frameworks. For instance, ones by Ricardo Foggiato and Alberto Chova. Basically, they develop a sensitivity framework where they think about how much measurement error would be needed such that the evaluation of your model would, go below some threshold. And this is one way to think about it. But the issue is that when you formally model it, there's so much uncertainty that you almost can't say anything useful. You end up with a guarantee that's vacuous and isn't actually giving you an informative assessment of your approach. So this makes it very difficult to say something very strong and rigorous theoretically based on an assessment of these issues. I think there's an interesting line of work to be had about thinking about how to actually appropriately reason about this uncertainty and to try to minimize it where possible. And we have some kind of ongoing work in this direction as well. But I think the most practical thing to do is to also just think about sensitivity analyses as well. So to think about how much would these issues need to occur before our result is going to be impacted. And the real upshot here is that suppose I have some result, I'm comparing an algorithm to a human, or I'm looking at some, network process, or whatever it might be, if the result is about the same, if a model and a human are performing about the same, really the error bars around that comparison should be much higher. So there's almost like a burden of proof that you would want to see some actual difference in effect size that's much larger in order to feel confident that really this is actually happening, in the real world with respect to all these different issues. So that's a bit maybe unsatisfying and fuzzy at this point, but I think it's also an opportunity for more work in this area. And I think it's quite interesting as well to think about how you might have more confidence around these evaluations given these challenges. But yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you. Thank you. I very much agree, and I really appreciate that you bring up this debate. So.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions here in the audience? People online? We have still 5 minutes. I do have some questions. So look, when you were explaining about the corrections you made, you mentioned that you had like a version of a corrected model, correct model. I wonder what's the relationship between correct model and fair model? Is that like direct translation or not necessarily, or what would be your interpretation there? And also when you talk about selection bias, when you correct them for this selection bias, does this mean that the model or the bias is gone or the whole thing is fair? So what would be your point on that?
Yeah, that's also a great question. Yeah, what's the relationship between correction and fairness? So I think that there's actually some other work that I think speaks to this very well, and that's Deb Raji has a paper on AI functionality harms, and maybe I can share that offline as well. But basically, that paper says that if a system's not working as expected, then it's kind of impact everybody. So kind of one argument is that if a system is not functioning as we expect it, it introduces a harm to everyone kind of almost equally, or at least in some sense, because it's going to impact how well that system is performing for everyone. Now I think that's true, but it's also a bit unsatisfying in that it's not actually talking about a disparity or some difference across different groups or thinking about fairness related harms. So to think about that kind of a relationship here, the things that I've talked about impact how we measure accuracy or overall performance of a system, and they also impact how we might measure disparities as well. So there's some work that thinks specifically about measurement error, for example, and thinking about how if you have measurement error in the label, that can impact your measurements of disparities. So I think that basically I almost view the things that I've talked about today as a precondition or a more general thing that we would want to address before we think about specific disparities or fairness related harms. Now, that said, I think it is true, we don't think about disparities exactly in this work. We don't have kind of fairness analysis or things like that. I think that if you were to provide the selection bias correction, for example, that would make kind of less represented populations, more represented in your objective. But I think there would be more work to do to think about specifically what impact that would have on different groups. And I think there's some work certainly some work about selection bias generally and how, selection bias in prior algorithms impacts the bias of predictors. There's a work called bias in, bias out that thinks about this directly. And so I think generally the things that we're proposing here would be likely to help. But if you're very concerned about disparities with respect to a subgroup, it is important to go beyond what I've talked about today and to actually think about, subgroup level disparities and how they're going to be impacted by measurement error. But I think that, kind of thinking of some of these issues as almost like a precondition for thinking about fairness or equity related things is one way to think about it.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Not, I will continue. I have two more. So just to put everything what you explained today into context, so you went through the example of health. I was wondering how would you put it in the context of credit scoring? So the decision would be like I say you will have high or low credit score, so to say, or risk score. What would be the outcome in this case? Like if the person really had a good credit, I don't know how to say it, but how would be the outcome in this case? Or what would be the outcome? Yes.
Yeah.
Imagine it.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I kind of just introduced it with one outcome. So, so in this case, often, lenders are interested in assessing credit worthiness. So they want to know whether an individual is worthy of receiving credit or is likely to repay. So it's kind of the broader kind of construct there is credit worthiness or, repayment ability. And then the outcome proxy there is thinking about default often. So typically people predict default, but actually, default sounds like a very simple thing. It's like, oh, whether or not they repay. But there's actually so many different levels of granularity around it to think about. So for instance, there's the question of default and how long, how long does it take before you default on this? There's actually a question of what constitutes default. So there's a notion of like technical default versus other types of default in which someone maybe misses a payment just barely, but that's considered default. And that could be very different than if someone truly doesn't have the financial resources to pay. So these things that feel very, solid, default and very simple, actually, when we peel back what's going on, really, there's a lot of decisions being made about these outcomes under the hood that are, impacting that as well. So this is what the credit example, a very famous example that people talk about a lot in criminal justice is the target outcome there is often crime. So whether someone commits a crime, and then the proxy is rearrest. So whether someone is arrested for that crime. And of course, you can have people who commit crimes who aren't arrested, and likewise, people who don't commit crimes who are falsely arrested. And actually, there's a whole literature in criminology about this. It's called like the dark figure in crime. People trying to analyze this too. So yeah, there's other. I think in the groundless truth paper we have some other examples as well. But it's kind of interesting to think about different domains and how this applies there.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Do you have 2 more minutes for my last question?
Yeah, of course.
So could you explain a little bit more about these anchor assumptions that it wasn't too clear for me?
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's really helpful. Let me pull this up here. Okay. So the anchor assumptions was the part that was unclear, kind of like the connection between the assumption and the overall goal, or was it the statement of the assumptions, or just for me to help refine the.
How would you come up with these assumptions? So you have this case. How would you said you need expertise to assign these values, no? So
yep.
Will you explain a little bit more with an example?
Got it. Yeah. So maybe I'll use the diagnostics example that we used kind of as a running example throughout the talk. And in this case, so there's kind of like 5 different options that you can have, 5 different assumptions that you can make. And actually, maybe this is the easiest one. One is that we have this min anchor assumption. So let's assume that we're going to develop a model for heart attack prediction. So there's kind of 5 different assumptions we can make. And one is that we just exactly know the false positive rate or false negative rate. So someone comes and tells me, I have a scientist that says, 10% of our heart attacks go undiagnosed and 20% are falsely diagnosed. So these are 2 settings to knowing these 2. And then the other 3 are ones that I talked about before. So one thing is someone could tell you based on, for example, a randomized controlled trial that on average in the population, people are, have a 10% risk of experiencing heart attack over some window. So this is basically saying that, the average risk of it. And then the min and the max is basically, the min risk says that there's someone who heart attack is guaranteed to not occur. And the max risk is that there's someone who's guaranteed for heart attack to occur. But basically, this is almost, you can imagine this is like a menu of options. And the goal is to then consult different people, in particular medical professionals, and kind of ask them which of these assumptions they feel would be reasonable or not be reasonable based on kind of information they have about the domain. And then from there, you make an assessment. Basically, what you need generally is for 2 of these assumptions to hold. So you would need like a base rate anchor to hold and the false positive rate, or anything with the checks. And if you're willing to make 2 of these assumptions for the check boxes, then you can basically use these pieces of information to correct for the measurement error. But if you're in a situation where you only know 1 piece of information, or you think none of them are true, or you think that, or you have like a min and the false, like, these settings where there's not a check, then there's kind of nothing you can do really to correct for the measurement error. So you can think of it as kind of like a menu of options to select from. And if the menu is reasonable, then you can kind of use these to correct for the error.
This would be
Yeah,
like
that's a
your
great
prior
question.
knowledge, sort of
Oh, what's that?
like your prior knowledge.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's basically prior knowledge. It's a bit different from like the prior elicitation framework under like a Bayesian framework. It's analogous to that, and I think a lot of that carries over. But it's more of like a binary thing in this case. Like, do you think this is reasonable or not? And I do think that that's one brittle aspect of this framework, in that you're kind of like, you have to assume yes or no, and there's not kind of a degree of confidence. So I think there's a lot of space to think about ways to actually express uncertainty in your beliefs about the measurement assumptions themselves.
Okay, cool.
But yeah, that's a great question.
Thank you. Any more questions from the people online? Okay, today the people online have been shy. No, that was from earlier. If that's not the case, well, thanks a lot, Luke, for joining us today, for giving an excellent talk. And yes, thank you everybody for attending.
Yeah, thank you so much for organizing this set, and everyone at Complexity Science Hub. And yeah, it was such a pleasure to be able to talk to you guys today. And yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your Thursday.
Yes, thank you. You too. Ciao, ciao.
Bye.